After nearly 4 decades, Showtime will exit boxing programming at the end of this year. Showtime Championship Boxing has televised some of the biggest fights in the sport. But what is next for the sport and how will it be broadcasted? So it's time for some boxing talk. We're going to do it with the co-host of the Mandatory Boxing Show, my guy, Bryan Fonseca, who joins me now. Bryan, how's it going?
Doing all right. Saddened by the news, obviously, of Showtime boxing no longer being a thing, but we'll discuss the unfortunate sort of, what happens now beyond that.
Yeah, we're going to discuss that. So let's get right into it, Bryan, because this news about Showtime getting out of the game, it came down on Tuesday. What was your reaction to this news, considering this comes after HBO announced that they were leaving the boxing business back in 2018? Was this a shock to you at all?
No, it's something that's been rumored since about that time. HBO left several years ago, and there's been rumors almost every year about, hey, when is Showtime? How much longer they're going to do this? And if you notice, their content has sort of steered away from boxing on the sports side, and their Showtime sports content, I'm not really sure how much of an impact it was making, respectfully, on the rest of sports. And I just had questions about the longevity of it. Then you have the piece about how much longer are they going to take boxing seriously? How much longer is anybody going to take boxing seriously? I have questions about how much longer ESPN and Top Rank will remain a thing, but obviously it benefits ESPN to have at least some sort of relationship with boxing. But Showtime and HBO are probably playing different games. And when the mergers happen amongst these big companies and you start sorting to blend one into the other, boxing becomes something that's expendable because it's not something that a lot of people care about more than a few times a year, if even that, for the major fights. And as somebody who covers sport, I wish that wasn't the case. And as somebody who loves the sport when it's at its best, I wish that wasn't the case. But it is what it is. A lot of people just don't take boxing seriously, unfortunately. And while I think they should, they've sort of been right to do so, or it has been their right to do so, because as it happens, are they really seeing a big loss for not partnering with the sport of boxing moving forward? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and you got to think, like you said, interest level in the sport from the average sports fan, along with the business decision that these networks had to make, leads us to where we are today. But we're going to also talk about another business decision, because Al Haymon's Premier Boxing Championship, they have an exclusive deal with Showtime, and it's been a pretty successful year for PBC and Showtime. Canelo Alvarez signed a 3-fight deal with PBC this summer. How does Showtime leaving boxing affect things for PBC going forward?
Well, PBC, when it started in 2015, it was sold as, hey, boxing is back on network TV, and it was PBC on NBC, PBC on CBS, PBC on Bounce TV, PBC on Spike, PBC on ESPN at one point. And it was on all these different channels. And then after a while, it was just PBC on Fox because everyone else seemingly left. And you would get, obviously, PBC on Showtime, which was the more common one. And we've seen fights be on Fox pay-per-view, like Deontay Wilder versus Tyson Fury. And we've seen fights on Showtime pay-per-view, like more recently Canelo Alvarez versus Jermell Charlo and Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford. And now PBC is just going to have to find a new partner. Is it going to be an Amazon? Is this where Apple is going to strike? I feel like, those are the two companies that a lot of people will look at just in general, not for boxing and not for boxing specifically, but just for anything regarding sports, because they seem to be, at the very least, experimental, willing to try a lot of different things and not seemingly tying themselves down long-term to anything. So maybe there's a solution there, but is boxing going to be a focus for a company that big as Amazon or Apple moving forward? Is that the best choice for it? And honestly, I just think that in some capacity, boxing is going to live on YouTube because it kind of already does.
Yeah, it seems to be where it is. And we've seen YouTube stars and that crossover with boxing and how that all works there, Bryan. So it's very interesting in that regard. I think what also is interesting, right, is with 2 big premium cable networks getting out of the boxing game, it makes me question, where does this leave broadcasting options for the best boxers in the sport to be seen? Is it streaming platforms like you mentioned, like Amazon or Apple? Is that where you see things headed? Are those the platforms where if you want to see boxing, that's where you're going to have to go? Or is it YouTube, like you just mentioned?
Yeah, I feel like YouTube has got to be the front runner here because a long time ago, when networks decided that boxing wasn't a needle mover and they weren't going to take the sport seriously, a lot of the content moved to YouTube, and a lot of the people who talk about boxing are on YouTube, and a lot of people outside of boxing don't really respect that, and some people inside boxing don't because the sport is kind of a mess in that way. And ultimately, I just think that for broadcasting, we'll see what's going to happen. ESPN has the top rank deal. DAZN has Matchroom, Golden Boy, Oscar de la Hoya's promotion, and then otherwise, where is the sort of landscape right now? How many people do you know have DAZN for boxing? I don't think it's that many, and there are ways to sort of watch the fight you want to fight. You want to watch if you're so inclined to do so, if you know what I'm talking about on the internet.
Hey, no
You
talk
know what
about
I mean?
no talk about that.
So that's the other thing. It's like, and then that's the other part of this, though. If you're charging $80 for a pay-per-view, some people are going to be like, all right, we're going to go to www. I won't say name of website.com where I can just watch the fight. And then that's going to be the sort of workaround for that. So it's the whole thing is a mess because pay-per-view is expensive. People aren't taking the sport seriously. There aren't a lot of eyeballs on the sport right now relative to where it was at one point in time. And the boxers themselves aren't really fighting as often as they probably should be, which is why it's probably not seen as profitable from people who don't really understand the sport. So you just have a confluence of things going on here. And honestly, I don't know because the sport is so seemingly beyond repair at some points. And I say that as somebody who has championed this year as being a great year for boxing. But then you have this news, despite this being, I thought, the strongest year for boxing in a few years, definitely since at least before COVID hit.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how strong it actually was. Not that it wasn't, but we saw great fights, obviously, like Terrence Crawford, Errol Spence this year. That was a big fight, big draw for Showtime and their pay-per-view. And still, here we are with boxing, with Showtime getting out of the game. Last thing for me, Bryan, with the departures of the iconic networks like HBO and Showtime from the sport, are these changes with these two companies getting out the game, is that good or bad for the sport of boxing?
I don't think when the two best companies at producing this sport leave, I don't think that's a good thing. I thought HBO was the best, the gold standard. HBO Boxing, HBO Boxing After Dark, World Championship Boxing. Like the memories that I've had of watching many Saturday nights and some Friday nights, just watching whatever fight was on HBO. The same thing with Showtime, and not just Showtime Championship Boxing, but also the Showbox series, where a lot of boxers that you've heard of, that you've seen coming up, who later became Hall of Famers, fought their early fights on Showbox on Friday nights as they were sort of developing and later becoming the stars that they became, moving to Showtime Championship Boxing. I just don't think that this is a win in any way. Now, maybe it pivots and then you start seeing PBC on Amazon, PBC on Apple TV Plus, or whatever the case may be. But I also think that in the sport where it's hard to make a profit for a lot of people, if you're going to continue to put it behind paywalls, it gets a little bit more challenging. So I think the next move for PBC is going to be very important. Though Ryan Garcia and Terrence Crawford tweeted out very interesting things on, like, there's something that boxers themselves could sort of do, band together and sort of make the business work. But the sport is just so, like, in a disappointing state in terms of how, like, dispiriting, how broken things seem to be, that really it just matters if all parties could come together in some sort of way. Then yeah, maybe you'll find a solution here. But it's going to take a lot of work to get that done, that I'm not sure it's going to be, because it's a problem that has been getting worse over the years.
Yeah, it is a problem. It's been getting worse. You've seen interest in boxing decline. We've seen the rise, when we talk about combat sports, the rise of UFC in this country and how popular that's been. I think a lot of that has to do with something you mentioned, Bryan. In the UFC, as opposed to boxing, fighters are fighting often. You see the fights that people want to see. You and I have talked about this plenty. That is Bryan Fonseca, co-host of the Mandatory Boxing Show. Go check that out. Bryan, thank you for your insight on this, and we will see what happens with boxing, where it is broadcasted, and the future of the sport.
Thank you for having me.